The fire made such progress that the whole of the northern and the greater part of the western quarter by which we had entered was burned, together with all the splendid playhouse and all the larger buildings. One drew breath in a sea of fire, and the westerly wind continued to blow. The flames spread continuously. It was impossible to predict where or when they would stop, as there was no means of staying them. The conflagration passed beyond the Kremlin. It seemed that the river would surely save all the district lying to the east. About 4 o'clock in the afternoon, while the fire was still raging, the emperor began to think that this great catastrophe might be connected with some movement of the enemy, even though frequent reports from the King of Naples assured him that the Russians were still retreating along the Kazan Road. The emperor therefore gave orders to leave the city and forbade anything to be left within its walls. Headquarters were established at the Petrovskoye Palace on the Petersburg Road, a country mansion where the czars were accustomed to take up residence before making their solemn entries into Moscow for their coronations. It was impossible to proceed thither by the direct road on account of the fire and the wind. One had to cross the western part of the town as best one could, through ruins, cinders, flames even, if one wanted to reach the outskirts. Night had already fallen when we got there, and we spent the following day in the palace. Meanwhile, the fire continued with renewed violence, but a part of the quarter between the Kremlin and the Petrovskoye, where headquarters and the guard were was saved. The emperor was deep in thought. He spoke to no one. The existence of inflammable fuses, all made in the same fashion and placed in different public and private buildings, is a fact of which I, as well as many others, had personal evidence. I saw these fuses on the spot, and several were taken to the emperor. They were also found in the quarter by which he entered the city, and even in the imperial bedroom in the Kremlin. Monsieur Duranel, the Duke of Treviso, Count Dumas, and many others observed them on their entrance, but paid no further attention, for they were far from thinking that the governor and the government had any ambition, as the emperor said, to go down to posterity as a modern Erostratus. The examination of the police, rank and file, and further admission by the police officer who was caught on the day we entered the city, all proved that the fire had been prepared and executed by the Lord Count Rostopchin. This police officer, whom Baron Lilornia had discovered in the city while looking for the deputation His Majesty had expected, was a simpleton who knew all that was afoot and was very candid in all his avowals, as was proved by many reports. He supplied details about the preparation for that fire, which left no further doubt as to the governor's orders, and in time shed the fullest light on the matter. Of the various incendiaries who were brought to judgment, some were executed and others left in prison, hapless victims of their obedience to their superiors and the orders of a madman, as the emperor said. Baron Lilornia's police officer, from whom at first, for lack of a better, he had drawn 1,000 bits of information, was so terrified at the outset that he appeared to be slightly deranged. Such, at least, was the impression left by his statements. His revelations seemed to be delusions of a demented man, and at the time no heed was paid to them. This unfortunate fellow kicked his heels for some time in the custody of the guard, where he was left when he was no longer needed. After the outbreak of the fire, his first statements were recalled. It was also remembered that when he had seen the first small fire break out, which was attributed to some campfires having been lit too near the wooden houses of the quarter, he had announced that before long there would be many other outbreaks. And when the main conflagration started, he exclaimed that the whole city would be burned, orders having been issued to that effect. In fact, all we had imputed to the disordered mind actually came to pass, so he was questioned anew. To what he had already told us, he now added, in confirmation of what several other incendiaries had informed us, that on the day before Governor Rostopchin's departure, several police officers were summoned to a particular locality, which he designated, other depositions confirm this, where they received orders to prepare for burning the city, that they had been instructed to be ready to carry out this order as soon as the signal was given, and that subsequently, after every meeting, the chiefs of police named a new rendezvous where the subordinates were to make their reports. On the appointed day, each senior officer had received the order at the time decided on by the governor and had transmitted it to the subordinates in his district for them to carry out. The fire engines had been taken away by firemen, and those that they had not been able to harness up had been deliberately made unfit for action and hidden away. Before entering Moscow, the emperor had intended not to take up his residence in the city. The fire and the consequent destruction of part of the supplies seemed likely to make him follow this first impulse. In fact, everything was ready for a withdrawal, and for a time Prince of Neuchâtel imagined that this would be carried out. But the successive reports from the King of Naples as to the breakdown of the Russian army and dispatches in which he drew pictures of the results which he hoped for and promised because of it soon made the emperor modify these arrangements. The king always saw the Russian army in flight along the Kazan road, the men deserting, disbanding in troops, the Cossacks ready to leave the army, some even disposed to make common cause with the victorious French. The Cossack chieftains overwhelmed the King of Naples with continual flattery, and he never ceased to give them tokens of his munificence. The vanguard had no heed to flight. The Cossack officers took instructions from the king as to the direction in which he wished to march, and where he desired to establish his headquarters. From the moment his outposts arrived, they were practically taken care of, to see that nothing went amiss. Out-and-out blandishments were resorted to gratify the king, and those marks of deference delighted him greatly. Accordingly, the emperor put small faith in his dispatches. Those marks of deference looked suspicious to him. He saw that the king was being made a fool of, and that he told him to distrust Kutuzov's pretended march on Kazan. The emperor could not fathom this movement of the army. This affectation of regard for the king, these exaggerated accounts of the enemy's breakdown and the discontent of the Cossacks, appeared to him as proofs of underhand work. Although such circumstances, if true, would have delighted him, he saw them for what they were, blinds to deceive the king as to what was really afoot, or baits to draw him into some trap. On September 18th, the emperor returned to the Kremlin. His departure from Moscow had been the signal for outbreaks of the gravest disorder. Such houses as had been saved from the fire were pillaged. Such unfortunate inhabitants as had remained were ill-treated. Shops and wine cellars were forced open, and thence flowed every excess, every crime that can result from the drunkenness of soldiers who have got out of their superiors' control. The city rabble, taking advantage of this disorder, began pillaging too, and led the troops to the cellars and vaults and anywhere else that they thought might have been used to conceal property in the hope of sharing the pillage. Those army corps, not actually the city, sent in detachments to secure their portion of the victuals and booty. The result of this systematic search can be guessed. All kinds of supplies were found, and plenty of wine and brandy. The grain and fodder warehouses along the quays had accepted the fire. The army horses had been so short a provender between Smolensk and Gat that from the battle until we reached Moscow, that everyone hastened to forage for them and got enough hay during the 2 days of the 15th and the 16th to last several months. Part of these provisions were consumed in the houses as they were found, and it was thanks to the surplus that we were able to live in abundance until our departure from the city, and even to keep the men and horses alive during part of the retreat. As soon as he returned to Moscow, the emperor began to busy himself with clearing the French army in the eyes of Petersburg from the odium of having caused the fire, which they had done their utmost to extinguish, and from which self-interest alone was sufficient to exonerate them.